We have 4 panelists who are going to talk today and debate, not so much debate, discuss, debate perhaps, as part of the online launching of this publication called Blacks Can't Be Racist, right? And my name is Andile Mnatama. I am the main author of the document. 2 other people who have contributed to this 10th anniversary print is Brother Ndumiso, who's part of this panel, Sister Ziana, and Georgia is, Ati Georgia is one of the Black intellectuals of our era. So we'll all have a good conversation about what is the meaning of this text, not only the text, but also this attempt to bring into the conversation the idea of Blacks can't be racist. So this text is 10 years old now. We will all start by 5 minutes interventions on our impressions of the significance of the text. I will go first, okay? And again, I apologize to everybody who has been waiting for as long as you have. We had serious technical glitches, but we are on now, we are live, I understand, and so we'll just proceed. Let me just take a historical point quickly on the text itself. Blacks Can't Be Racist, this essay was written as a response to a real situation, right? So what happened in 2008 rather, 2008, which was a year after Zuma became president of the ANC, not of the country, which was the year 2007. The year 2008, there was a meeting of a Black Journalists Forum. This is the organization was called the Black Journalist Forum, okay. Forum for Black Journalists, yeah. Forum for Black Journalists. They invited the president of the ANC to talk to them. And this organization of journalists was for Blacks only Black journalists. So they invited Zuma to come to talk to them in this Black only meeting, 2008, February. And white journalists actually insisted that they were going to break into that meeting, and they were physically stopped from breaking into this meeting of Black journalists. Our people don't maybe recall this, but it was a big issue. As a consequence of this forum of Black journalists, excluding these white journalists went to complain to the Human Rights Commission, and the Human Rights Commission had hearings, public hearings. And I participated in those public hearings, presenting the ideas which became this essay, Blacks Can't Be Racist, to assist the commission in explaining why it cannot rule against this forum of Black journalists as a consequence of a complaint by white journalists. Unfortunately, the commission ruled against the Forum for Black Journalists, and that organization disappeared, right? So 10 years later, I mean, interesting parallel is that we see Black First, Land First also being banned in South Africa as a consequence of being a Blacks only organization. But the historical point I wanted to raise is where does this idea or this essay originate from? Was a response to a real situation of Black people being told you can't organize as Black people because that is racist. So the essay was written to provide an explanation and a defense for our rights as Black people to organize as Blacks. And when it was published, the essay, it was very popular. We sold about 10,000 copies within the period of 3 years at a time. And it was a big conversation. And one of the things that are important, I think, from this essay is this idea that we Black people have to maintain the concept of what we call conceptual fidelity. In other words, if Black people are going to have their claims for reparations and restitution taken seriously, we must fight conceptually, ideologically, philosophically to maintain this idea of Blacks can't be racist. If we don't do that, we are going to end up being victims in the process that seeks to redress racism or even discrimination. And I can confidently say, in the past 10 years, this warning of this essay has come to be. So measures to deal with racism quickly put Black people in a situation where we are now the racists and we are now the perpetrators. There is, in the new introduction, long introduction I take some time going through what has happened in the past 10 years in as far as the race discourse, race practices in South Africa are concerned. And one of the things that at the end I show is even this new scholarship being generated by things like the Institute of Race Relations, where patently they tell us that white people are experiencing racism. And not only that, but state institutions such as the State SA is actually accepting this proposition that the white people are now the victims of racism. Okay, so the fight is on, and this essay really was about empowering Black people to lay claim on reparations and restitution as victims of racism, right? But I'll stop there simply to say, first, it was a response to a real situation. It is not an intellectual abstract treatise. It's about how do we fight a central problem facing Black people. And this essay, in some ways, and it does not provide any new material, but it has reintroduced some ideas which has been generated by Black people across time trying to deal with the issue of racism. So I think for me, that is it. Today, we are facing the same problem. And I show in the introduction, my new introduction, the reversals that has happened. There's been some promises, but there's been major reversals conceptually. And we're sitting today where Black people are treated as, because there's formal equality. Therefore, we can't claim any special position in society. But so I'll stop there and simply say, for me, firstly, let's remember this essay was a response to a real situation of Black people saying, we as Black journalists want to organize as Blacks, and the South African constitutional order simply saying that's not possible. And this has again been confirmed by the experiences of Black First Land First, which is a Blacks only organization, has been told, you can't operate on the basis of just being Black, because if you do that, you are racist. So I'll leave it at that. That is my first opening gambit. So let's hear maybe Comrade Ndumiso, and then we'll take Georgia, and then we'll take Comrade Ziana. And I must go get a charger.
All right. No, thank you, my brother. Well, I think to reiterate the point made by Andile, I guess in my entrance into this discussion, what was important to recognize is precisely that we're not simply dealing with a lexicographical issue about the definition of words, even though this debate is often placed in the terms about a contest regarding language and what the dictionary says racism is. The point is that the dictionary itself has a political history. And this is the contention of my own contribution and defense of the original essay. Eusebius Makeza, in clouded terms, represented the liberal worldview in a critique of the Blacks can't be racist argument, focusing on the point that if the argument was that Blacks lacked the political and economic power to perpetrate racism, this was a historically contingent argument which wouldn't hold for all time, and according to him, no longer held at this time. And so the point was that the argument in all its iterations, even if being made now, is simply that Blacks can't yet be racist. Now, my contention is that in addition to economic and political power, which I think it can be shown that Blacks continue to lack even now, but even if we would concede on that part, which I would not, the point is that Blacks lack historical power. And it's a very precise species of power, which includes the power over the meaning of words and concepts. So the point is that the definition of racism is a properly political struggle that can take us quite far back into the history of South African politics. It concerns serious problems in political theory about the nature of society, the role of the individual, and the operations and machinations of political power. And so, of course, the point is that we've seen that this definition also has the power, I mean, to imprison people. It has the power to avoid historical justice. It's not simply a debate over scribbles on the paper, but the interpretation over those scribbles on the paper actually has an existential impact in the way that history continues to unfold. So the point was about, one, the power to define, but also the power of definitions over people's lives, you know. And so this was really the way in which this discussion was unfolding. I hope some of the recent developments, like the recent judgment in the magistrates court regarding one brother who called another one a kafir, can be dealt with, because it appears to have confused a number of people, both black and white. White people crying about the question of definitions have said that there's an inconsistency here, and that surely what's good for the goose must be good for the gander, and the black who says kafir must be treated like the white who says kafir. After all, they suggest that he is also perpetrating anti-black racism. But you know, the point is, this brings an interesting nuance in precisely this assertion that blacks can't be racist. But I hope that we'll get into this during the discussion. Thank
you. In my case, I mean, the pamphlet is part of a larger body of work that New Frank Talk did. Stuff that were very valuable and very, not so much aggressive, but very confrontational in terms of how an attempt to shift public perception, you know, in politics and everywhere else in South Africa. But Blacks Can't Be Racist, I mean, is one of those texts that remained contentious throughout. I mean, there was also what do you call Why Biko Would Not Vote, which also just created a very serious tension. And then there was another one on that Chinwezu did. A number of these texts, which were really, really, they met, or rather were received very negatively by a lot of white people, but positively by a number of young Black people. But over the years, I mean, what I have been thinking about in relation to the text has been about questions that have been raised around, people going back to Biko's notion of Black, you know. For example, what would we mean when we say Blacks can't be racist? Who are the Blacks of Blacks can't be racist? I mean, this is a very contentious question, and the pamphlet doesn't really address this particular issue, because, I mean, at the end of the day, there's a certain kind of pervasive anti-Blackness that we have not really accounted for in South Africa. And for me, if you take the term, I mean, Duke spoke about the political position of the dictionary. If we were to think about the question of race, race has a much more general approach to the question, or rather racism affects a lot of people, but it doesn't affect them in the same way. But when you think about how, for example, someone like Dr. Kamakel and them, when they raise the question of the blacks of blacks who can't be racist, they had a very specific group of people that they were talking to. And this becomes very slightly contentious now in South Africa. I would say, you know, when we say blacks can't be, who are we talking to? Who are these blacks who cannot be racist? And on top of that, I mean, Biko himself, you know, or rather the entire Black consciousness movement had already split black to be, you know, a number of things. So who are these blacks who cannot be racist? Is it blacks who are historically determined by the colonial situation, or is it the blacks who Biko deemed are the blacks? You know, so I mean, it's not clear. I mean, I'm saying in terms of thinking about updating Black consciousness, as we were trying to do in the 2008, 2009, 2010 time. You know, I mean, one of the things to go back to now is maybe to think about this question, which has caused a number of confusions. When we're talking about black people, who are the blacks of blacks can't be racist?
Cool. Are you good? Okay. So I have, of course, no way of answering that particular question. And I'd also like to hear some responses to it. But I think it's a necessary question because I think it ties into a very concrete conversation about who comprises the nation, in particular in South Africa. And so, yeah, I think we should discuss it. That having been said, I want to thank you, Ati and Anila, for the entire NRF series. I think it was so important for me a decade ago, and my own sort of political, ideological, conceptual growth, and I'm constantly returning to it. So I'm glad that it exists in the world. And I remember us talking about it again. There was a time we had a conversation at the Anti-Racism Action Forum. And at the time we were sort of having a weird discussion about whether institutional and structural meant the same thing. Anyway, questions that now seem really insignificant. Anyway, but I think it's, the text done a very important thing at its time, because I think the 1994 project was successful in one sense, in the sense that it really solidified or reified a kind of state narrative of formal and legal equality, even though, of course, the actual social historical situation contradicted this narrative completely. Nevertheless, a lot of people sort of believed, that it was a moment of freedom. It was a time when everyone was going to be equal. Everyone was going to be treated equally in the legal institutions and so on. And I think what this done, and I think why it's so necessary for the reproduction of white supremacy, is that it functions on a kind of double denial. So the first denial being the denial of the humanity of Black people, and the second denial being the denial of this denial. Mm-hmm. Such that in the first instance, the denial of your humanity means that you're oppressed. In the second instance, to deny that fact then means that you have no recourse to redress. And so I think at the end of the new preface, the new author's preface, there's a kind of push to have the logic of, or the idea of Blacks can't be racist as a kind of mode of redress or principle of redress, I think the term is. And I think the series, but this essay in particular, done a lot in bringing up the ways in which resistance itself is foreclosed for Black people. And so, and I mean, the end of the new preface has a really pessimistic tone that it ends on. It's like, you know, we're on the back footing again, and this is not great. Look at all these white people who are both perpetrators of racism and somehow also victims of racism. But I think in the last decade, so much has happened just on an actual political level. Marikana, if we think of Marikana as a precursor to the student movement, if we think about the EFF like finally exposing itself as being seriously committed to white supremacy, if we consider all these moments in the last 10 years, it makes something like BLF actually possible in a time now. So I think, you know, as Lennon says, there are decades in which nothing happens, and there are weeks in which decades happen.
Lenin belongs to the other guys, man. Let them help him, man. Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for those inputs. I just want to, you know, some of the things that have been raised are important, but particularly picking up on how thinking about race can be racist has practical implication for resistance or organization. And I just want to throw in here, because we think in 10 years time, like when we started up to now, in between we had the emergence of FeesMustFall as an example. I mean, before Blackfest, Landfest, you have FeesMustFall, which organizationally suggests something like, okay, this idea of Blacks can be racist is important. I mean, I'm saying this because Roads Must Fall at UCT at the beginning had said it's a Blacks only project. I mean, and then it was even saying whites must organize as separately, right? But it seems you have become confused with the march of time when it becomes more fees must fall than roads must fall. I'm wondering if, you know, we have any insights into that, because when I was looking at that movement, student movement, I felt like the ideas which were initially expressed in this essay had found some kind of concrete expression in organization. And I'm aware that some people had read the text, but of course there was a difficulty of actually acknowledging that these ideas come from, you know, a character that was not so accepted by this movement, right? You know, a little bit, I feel like Althusser, you know, 68 in France, you know, Althusser is rejected by this whole movement, which is actually calibrated by his ideas, right? So that was my feeling. And he leaves France, he goes away, he's not part of the resistance. I did not reject Roads Must Fall in particular. But I did feel at the time that, wow, these ideas that we've been thinking about are finding expression. I just wonder if you have any insights into that.
I don't know if I can go on this one first. No, look, I mean, I think the roads must fall, fees must fall thing also provokes this problem about discursive power again. I mean, I think we know that one of the dangerous powers that whites have at their disposal has been the monopoly over the writing of history. And of course, you know, as E-News channel calls itself history's first draft, supposedly being the news. But the point is that they are discursive power in their representation of reality, which is then calcified as actual reality and has the power to transform reality subsequently because of their ability in winning this unanimity in representation by the virtual erasure of all other perspectives. We've seen the whites of the Congress movement do this, for instance, both in the expulsion of the Africanist tendency in the Congress movement and in the virtual erasure of the Africanists who left, and in the erasure of the Africanists inside the Congress, the Makiwanes, the Gang of Eight, for instance, who are completely absent from South African history. But we've seen this also in the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall, in such a way that texts that come out either prefer to speak of a must fall movement or speak of fees must fall in the collective, as though the one is simply an advanced iteration of the other, a development of the same logos, that there isn't a fundamental contradiction between these moments that actually reverberates through South African history as Black consciousness versus white consciousness. Of course, white consciousness finding expression in multiracialist formulations like that of the movement. So Fees Must Fall has already discursively conquered Rhodes Must Fall in the literature. Certainly, if you look at text, and white academics outnumber us in their virtual proliferation of their lies. They can do this at such large scale that they become reality. And any foreign researcher trying to find out what happened here in 2015 will be hit with the preponderance of fees must fall or must fall, with a very deliberate falsification, a deliberate obfuscation of the contradiction brought to bear by Rhodes Must Fall. And this is the legacy of the Black, this is the most dangerous question brought about by the Blacks can't be racist argument, is that whites don't necessarily, how they conquer is through representation. Their historical power has already confused, it's already obfuscated the fundamental contradiction between these two, thereby turning this into just another UDF, you know?
Okay, let's hear Comrade Ziana and then Comrade Ati. I'm just thinking that is interesting because that conflation and erasure of the first moment, it's more a Marxian project in the sense that it emphasizes what access than the original question of obliteration of the whole colonial order. But Comrade Ziana?
I mean, I'm a little bit too wary about treating the Rhodes Must Fall moment as if, you know, this was the great decolonial sort of Africanist intervention of the last decade. And also, I'm wondering what we think Rhodes Must Fall might have been a development of. So not only as like the originary seed, but also as something that was produced out of very particular conditions at the time, right? Fees Must Fall sort of, you know, I agree with you completely, Dooms, that it sort of hijacked a moment. But also the complaints of Fees Must Fall, they become important because they then find themselves at a white institution. But, you know, I mean, every single year, people at Black universities for Blacks have the same kind of problem of access that is particularly financial. And, you know, there's this very strange kind of, if we just make it in, then things will be fine, which then UCT's Rhodes Must Fall moment completely like opened up. It doesn't matter that you're in, it doesn't matter that you're a middle-class Black person that's like 20-something years old. It doesn't matter that you were promised all these things by the Demonation, all these things are false. And a very serious contradiction comes to play. But I mean, personally, I think the argument of Blacks can't be racist and the publication of the text at that time definitely lays the groundwork for Rhodes Must Fall later on. It so happens that all these other things happen as well. For me, Marikana is a huge thing in changing the common sense, in changing how words are being spoken. Prior to that moment, I don't think it was as easy for people to say we want the land back or whatever. I think actually, I mean, you were even crazier at that point. I mean, people think Andile is crazy now, but at that time you were just, you know, a kind of like a madman for making that position. So I think, yeah, I mean, I can see a resonance between FeesMustFall in particular and the text.
No, for me, you know, what is important is that the text.
Georgia, sorry, man, let me interrupt you. You have a lot of books behind you. What is the significance of this?
We made this joke earlier. The point is that he needs to present himself as an intellectual. So he positioned his desk, like, you know. So like,
go ahead, my brother.
You know, one of the reasons why you people got slow, because you wanted me to move around in this place so that I can hide the wealth.
All this wealth of knowledge.
Hey, man.
But is it in here or is it there?
I know it's here. Yeah. I hear it. No, one of the things that if I were to relate the thing between the pamphlet and the FeesMustFall, or rather Roads Must Fall, was actually attitudes. I mean, this is not to say the attitude was unprecedented, but there was a certain kind of attitude that came with Black people knowing which they have an ethical responsibility, but also they are not, I mean, an ethical responsibility to respond to a historical problem. But also they were not bound by, at least at that particular moment, not bound by the liberal kind of code of saying, you know, if Black people raise any kind of point about race, then they are perpetuating racism, because they had somehow psychologically liberated themselves, even temporarily, from the insidious claims that white people would make for people, for Blacks to say those things out loud. I mean, the moratorium on even the race question in South Africa. So for students to come out and say, you know, fuck white people, you know, there was a whole situation around a t-shirt that said kill white people or fuck white people or something like that. And all the kind of, the temperament of the time could showed a certain kind of attitude that was no longer imprisoned in the logic of what you call it, of, you know, if you act in this particular way, then you're racist. It had to come out like that. It had to be confrontational. And that confrontation was, I would argue, based on the idea that Black people knew that acting like this in public and towards white people was the most righteous thing that was available to them, right? It was not racist. It was, if anything, the most just thing to do. So for me, the relationship between the text and FeesMustFall, rather Roads Must Fall, was that. And when FeesMustFall emerges, and I remember there was, we always forget about this, there was a letter, I believe, written by Assata Shakur. Yeah. And she begged the students, she even says, don't think white people are your friends. Don't involve white people in this thing. White people are not your friends. And, you know, and it for me, that was one of those things where it said, you know, it pushed Black people, Black students particularly, to not succumb to this kind of white hegemonic voice, or which, if you exclude yourself, then you are limiting yourself to to a very narrow understanding of emancipation or liberation, blah, 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 blah. You know what I'm saying? So that for me was great. I mean, the fact that Asata Shaku came in and iterated that, it was important. But how it disappeared, I mean, maybe it has to do with the fact that so many other things came in between. You know, the idea of roads became too abstract for other people. You know what I'm saying? There were so many other issues that were raised in between that made white supremacy, you know, a figment, and something that had absolutely nothing to do with the material reality, at least in terms of how it was articulated at the time.
Yeah, but
Okay.
No, go ahead.
Yes, no, I think this question of the transition, roads must fall, fees must fall, and the movement, that movement itself needs serious treatment, you know, which I don't think it has been provided, what that moment suggested. But certainly, I think there's some consensus about those who observe that it had moved away from the fundamental question of colonialism to the question of access to the same colonial institution, right? Not only that, the movement died because the movement became the student movement, a new development in South African resistance. Still, because Sobukwe are students themselves at the time, but they don't raise their issue as students, they raise it as a problem for Black people in general. I think part of the problem of this phase was, and there was this seduction by the media in particular, to always maintain it's a student thing, don't interfere, it's a student thing, don't make it a community project. But let's leave it at that. Coming back to Blacks Can't Be Racist, there's this claim that we make that it provides for a language for Black people. It's not a new language, but as I say, it was just to bring together concepts which have been there about how Black people need to think about their resistance and claim to reparations. I just want to make an example about how I personally, for a long time, and I'm making this point to emphasize that there was a way in which there is a way in which Blacks can be racist, empowers Black people to not only be confident that it's okay to fight as Black people, to fight for your liberation as Black people. You don't have to worry about what white people do. It's okay. Your problem is a unique problem. I'm arguing that for a long time, we did not have this organized form of expressing this problem. And Blacks Can't Be Racist for the first time in a long time. Because the 70s, you can argue that Biko and them were very clear. Get rid of the liberals, white liberals. It is your project. It is your oppression. But there was apartheid then. So democracy comes, it means that you can no longer speak in Black terms. For the first time, this text again says, no, we must speak in Black terms. But let me just explain how I struggled for a long time myself with this. When I left university, I got a job, and my boss was a guy from UDF. And he kept on saying to me, why do you emphasize Black? Are you inferior to white people? So emotionally and psychologically, I was then seduced to simply say, no, but I'm not inferior, okay? Because if I accept that Black occupy a special position, then it's an admission somehow of something wrong with the position of Blackness. So I had to overcome this hurdle to insist that actually to speak in Black terms is what must happen, not this, attempt. I suppose, you educated people talk about maybe expressing myself in the universal, expression of global brotherhood of Black and white. Black doesn't matter, white doesn't matter, we're all humans, But I'm saying it is a serious project, because the Mandela Project, democracy, and even today's conceptions of fairness. Fairness means you must not talk about race. And I think some of us who've been working on the race question and using race categories, we underestimate how deep and entrenched this idea of expressing yourself as Black has become. And I'm arguing that, and I want to hear what you say. This essay, if you haven't read Blacks Can't Be Racist, you're going to struggle. Black first, land first, blacks can't be racist. Well, it's the same idiom. All I'm saying is, if you haven't, and you're a young activist, I am in a sense saying to young activists who may come across this conversation, particularly if you're black and you want to put up a fight against the white system, you gotta get the basics of Blacks Can't Be Racist. Otherwise, you can't make progress. This is my argument. So I'm arguing that this essay, not inventing, but bringing to some accessible form a language that assists resistance. And without that, I can't see how black people can, in fact, launch resistance against the white system.
Right. Yeah, so on this same front, but, you know, returning us just a few steps back, I mean, I think it may just be that the problem of carpenters with hammers seeing every problem as a nail, but my sense is that the, you know, black resistance once again was usurped at a theoretical and intellectual level and then neutralized in the same way, you know, as has been happening throughout the modern struggle of our people. At least in Eskatsabo Pambata, there was no question of whites infiltrating the movement and leading blacks to away from the whites, you know, when it was simply a question of immediate death. But at least since the advent of the Communist Party, we've had a problem of the primary strategy which whites have used is to infiltrate black organizations. And if the infiltration is not a physical infiltration, it's an intellectual and theoretical infiltration. Mm-hmm. And so you can have a movement full of black people singing Marxism, Leninism, under the tutelage of white teachers, but, you know, producing strategies which are ill-conceived and themselves incapable of producing black liberation because the terms of interpretation of the problem itself are incorrect and have their basis on really an anti-black world historiography. So if you look, for instance, at the way in which the Rhodes Must Fall movement, later becoming Fees, became the justification for the adoption of the Latin American post-Marxist decoloniality paradigm and its virtual hegemony at the universities. The first point of suspicion was UCT starting a directorate of decolonial studies. This should be the first sign for anyone that this is a toothless hound, that UCT is willing to give it its own department. You know, first of all, the granting of a department to a supposed theoretical paradigm is a method of quarantine in order to protect the disciplines away from this wishy-washy nonsense. But the method of incorporation is also a concession that this does not fundamentally disturb the community of disciplines. Business is allowed to go on as usual. And if you analyze something like decoloniality, I mean, it's a UDF intellectual paradigm. It's brought in from Latin America, but really it's a bunch of white guys from Latin America and no Amerindians or descendants of the slaves amongst them. Mignolo, Babale, Bonkenje, the entire lot, you know. And on the back of this—
you're making enemies, bruh.
In the back of this black struggle, this thing becomes incorporated in universities and becomes the basis through which these black students are supposedly going to wage their struggle. Here, I think the responsibility, I mean, besides attacking our enemies, I think that black intellectuals are very poorly organized. This continues to be the case. I think when the students needed help or friendship or camaraderie, unfortunately, it's charlatans like Achille Mbembe who were there to swoop in and recalibrate the way. Yeah, people got full professorships on the back of the student struggle. It's no secret that numbers of promotions were achieved, accomplished on the back of the student struggle. But the point is that these charlatans were able to usurp this. Even though these are well-established anti-Black figures, we know that. We've discussed that long before the student struggle. These are enemies of our people, discursively. They've been working with our enemies to fuck Black people up for a long period of time. But these people were nevertheless able to usurp the most promising Black movement of our time. They were able to do so because Black students, Black kids don't actually know who their friends are. They, it was very clear. I mean, some of the young students, my younger brother was also involved, and I became close with the UCT contingent one way or the other. But, the moves they were making in their formation of friendship and allyship, even with so-called Black intellectuals, shows that there's a vacuum. After the onslaught of BCM by white liberals, we still haven't recovered. There's a vacuum which made it possible for that space to be usurped. I agree that the essay is very important, and if you look as early as 92, 93, a group of BC exiles wrote an essay called Towards Lasting Constitutional Change, actually attacking the negotiations themselves, that they were ill-conceived and would produce an anti-Black constitution. Figures like Mutsuku Peko, a previous Andile, a guy who also looked really clean in parliament, talking about land, seeming bloodthirsty. When we all wanted South Africa, our land, the guy looked crazy and bloodthirsty, were proven to be right. But because they were able to appear as madmen on the fringes, their space was taken up by bald heads who usurped. It's just a coincidence that one of these brothers is actually bald. I was using it in the Bob Marley sense, but bald heads. And some of the bald heads now have hair like ours, my brother. Yeah. As you know, they write books called The Land Is Ours. So it's very dangerous.
Wow, you are just throwing so many shots right now. Also, what is going on? Sure.
I'm closing, but the fact that these charlatans are able to usurp this way suggests that somebody else is guilty. It cannot simply be the naivety of the students, and it cannot simply be the ruthlessness of the usurpers. It means that there's people that are not doing their jobs. Right. Some of us are not doing our jobs. We haven't gotten our house in order as far as a structure of publication in the dissemination of information through our own channels. New Frank Talk was an accomplishment in the way, as an institution, it didn't depend on their newspapers, it didn't depend on their TV, it didn't depend on their accession, and yet you can find them in all their libraries because it couldn't be ignored. But those institutions themselves, which follow on the backs of our Scots, this is the place where we're failing to infiltrate this discourse. And this is where the usurpers are able, through CNA, through Penguin Books, Staffelberg, through the institutions that we're actually in battle with, they're able to take over the space because we don't have any institutions. So we appear to be complainers with our 9 o'clock sessions like this, but there's nothing that someone can go and get to put it, okay, now lento leyenziwe la machita lawa, sisibonele. And our predecessors, even in the European white left, this is one of the crucial keys that the establishment, and this is something at least that people and his comrades got right, So I think
there are institutions that Black people have attempted. One of the reasons why some of these institutions no longer exist is because they are attacked. Every Black institution that emerges is constantly attacked, not only by white people, but also by Black people, and even former Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist intellectuals. There is a concerted effort to make sure that Black institutions, those that openly say we represent Black people, are constantly either misrepresented, caricatured, or totally prohibited. You see what I'm saying? So there is the disappearance of most of these institutions are based on the fact that they are regarded as unconstitutional.
But Georgia, but that's as it should be.
No, I know. What I'm saying is that Kalogu, the disappearance is not because there are no efforts being done. It's just that, you know, there is a constant assault on these institutions. And so you move from one institution to another, one institution, and not even institutions, but also movements. So you get groups or even social movements that begin as Black movements. You have one white person there infiltrating that movement. And the next thing, that entire movement is taken to the DA. Like, you have all kinds of attack.
But isn't this the point that Dooms is making, that failure, this incapacity to accumulate our position and to consolidate is a function of a failure to develop our own ideological conceptual tools
No, I agree.
Anticipate and respond.
No, I agree. But I'm just saying, like, the attack part, the fact that we are being attacked, we are not necessarily standing still. Whenever we emerge with something, that thing is consistently attacked. And what we tend to do at the moment is not to regroup, you know, to reorganize. In what we do is to split further and further and further. And that is what partly helps the project of these people. I mean, how a lot of people regard, let's say, like how people rejoice when Black First Land First was deregistered. Like, it was crazy how people actually were so relieved and happy that
Black people.
Black people were Black BLF was deregistered. So I mean, it is something that is really, I mean, not even one of these mega intellectuals came out to, not even about Black First Land First, but a lot of these Black organizations to speak on behalf of, or rather on the need to have these Black institutions. Like, I mean, of course, the only institutions that you would now call Black is like Abantu, is it Abantu? I mean, those are the kind of versions. I mean, it's absolutely not what we, you know, I mean, there was, of course, a defense that came from a couple of friends around that Indian lady who attacked Abantu and saying it was a Blacks only thing. Why is it a Blacks only thing? Blah, 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 blah. And the defense, of course, that was used for that was that it was, they used the BC orientation, which I found really shoddy at the time. So I mean, like, these are the kind of things that are already, like Ndumsu was speaking about the decolonial department at UCT. Abantu is a similar variation of the same stream. It is Black insofar as it is permitted to be. You know what I'm saying? So I'm saying all the great, really troublesome institutions have been under attack.
But maybe, Ziana, before you go there, and then I'll also open this for the other conferences, this, you know, part of this conversation in the introduction, the new introduction to the essay, I try to frame this to say, if you look at the past 10 years, there's this first moment of, I associate with the Blacks Can't Be Racist, Rose Must Fall moment. This is a frontal attack on the white project. Then as a response, you have, and Dooms has made a nice contribution in this current publication, his contribution dealing with the arguments of Eusebius Mekeza. Now, you know, Dooms, when you said charlatans, even Eusebius Mekeza became a spokesperson of decolonialization. I mean, you know, I went into a book conversation and he was talking about decolonization, Eusebius Mekeza, and he wrote a whole book a chapter attacking Blacks Can't Be Racist. So that is the second, if you like, moment of liberals speaking anti-racism to justify racism. So, and then you have the last moment, which Ziana, I'd like you also to comment on that. I call it synthetic, right? A rage against racism. So, for instance, how is it possible a movement coming from part of FeesMustFall, like EFF, is able, in practice, to find common cause, whether it's tactically or strategically, with the representatives of white supremacy, the DA? So these people claim to undertake a project against racism. However, in practice, they still find ways in which they can accommodate openly racist structures. So I call that synthetic, this fake rage against racism. And I'm saying it's part of the last 10 years' practices. There is resistance, which try to go confrontational. Then we have this second moment of Eusebius, Ferial, Hafeji. They both write books, by the way, on racism. And you look at those books, actually, they're not about obliterating the racist project. It's about precisely recuperating and defense. And then you have this last moment, which is more confusing, where people are openly declaring war against the racist structures, but actually also finding accommodation with the same. I mean, how do we work through that?
So in the preface, you do this like 3 aspects of what had happened with race discourse. The first being RMF, the second being the Eusebius Hafeji vibe, and the third being the EFF conjoining with the DA, right? And I think one strength of the essay on that note, definitely, and you speak about the title, there being some disagreements about the title or whatever. I think it at some point became very difficult to appropriate. So the liberal consensus wasn't really able to take up the language in a way that was really good in that first period, where it became like a sort of combative tool, Black people becoming rightly arrogant, whatever. But I think, and this ties into Ndum's concern about decolonial thought, but also, I mean, and I have to say, the presence of white Marxism in South Africa, this kind of co-option of the discourse. What does become troublesome is that they were able to co-opt it and run with it quicker than we were. And on one level, I'm with Ati to say, like, and of course these things happen in tandem, like Black institutions get destroyed before they even begin, they get infiltrated, they get taken to the Constitutional Court, they get all these things. At the same time, there's a way that there's always a kind of moment, like right now with the pandemic, there's a kind of moment that lacks a kind of pragmatic, opportunistic Black left that can co-opt the moment and go with it, right? So what then happens is that we sort of relinquish it to a kind of liberal, Hafeji, Eusebius, ahistorical, anti-intellectual, white supremacist without self-declared tendency. So decolonial thought, Marxism, all of these kinds of things. And I think, I don't know how we'd be able to sort of think about Blacks can't be racist again in a way that its language becomes uncomfortable. Because I think the discomfort about the language that made white people so hesitant to picking it up initially maybe got lost in all the other activities of the concrete situation at the time.
And Dums and Ati, maybe just 2 minutes if you want to chip in there. I mean, this need to develop a discourse of resistance which resists cooptation, which is what, and I agree with this articulation that Blacks can't be racist for the longest time was just refused, and I think it still does, this cooptation. I got stories because for a little while, exclusive books was distributing Blacks Can't Be Racist. And just if you hear stories of the people working in the shops, how white people will pick up the document, the pamphlet, right? But they will quickly put it inside some other publication, okay? So that they are not seen to be reading a document that says Blacks Can't Be Racist, because immediately it points to them. If Blacks can't be racist, who can be, right? So, but I just think in their own behavior, the immediate reaction was not to be seen with the document. However, of course, I mean, it's white people, they need to see what we are saying, but don't legitimize this document by making it, you know, which is good from our point of view, that we are not going to have a conversation with white people about whether Blacks can be racist or not. This is a conversation that we have amongst ourselves so that we respond to the attacks that disable us to respond to racism. And Doom's touching on this decolonial project and the way you have, it is quite provocative. I mean, I haven't had such stringent, open, shall we say, robust engagement with these brothers. It has become an industry. You can't say anything without saying the colonial. It's impossible. But now, I did not know that UCT has created a ghetto where you can actually run this project there. And so we are running around here going to Barcelona every year. I think everybody goes to visit Barcelona.
Yeah.
and but there is a ghetto right here and part of what Georgia was saying of this, about this attempt, now I'm trying to talk about refusal to appropriate. You know, the statue of Rhodes, Cecil John Rhodes, was removed by consensus, right? Was removed by consensus, was removed by a process articulated by power. It was not destroyed, it was shifted. When, as you say, Georgia, Assata Shakur takes big risks through the CIA and everything, writes a letter to the students, destroy the statue with your own hands. What we see is a retreat, and I would argue that part of that retreat is the retreat ideologically that we have seen, where we come to acceptable behavior in a sense, which is exactly what I don't know how we can sustain, which we must, a practice which refuses to be co-opted. But isn't it the problem of Black First, Land First in some ways, that once you maintain that position, you are not just intellectual, I mean, socially ostracized, but the laws of this country themselves put you out. But that is the only way at the same time that can lead us to a real confrontation with this monster that we must destroy. So I'm just saying the competition question, how do we deal with that?
You know what I thought, like at the level of culture, what was so strange about this retreat and the subsequent entry of decoloniality was a retreat from the more robust and arrogant posture of Black radicalism to a certain kind of neo-tribalist self-fashioning, right? Of people treating their initial confrontation of the statue, or rather replacing it with this, I am proud to be Xhosa, I am proud to be a graduate at UCT, I am proud to be, you see what I'm saying? Like, so the actual unifying act of resistance was somehow dissolved culturally by retreating to very strange identity politics. This is not to say they were irrelevant, but they emerged after a certain kind of relaxation at the level of confronting white supremacy, right? So white supremacy disappears as the main problem. And what you find is these are the things that come up. And for me, that was one of the most disturbing things that I thought, and this is of course not to say there was no burning of cars, there was no toying around, but the motivation the disappearing of whiteness as the historical problem at the time led to a number of very weird problems. I mean, at the level of culture.
But wouldn't you add Abantu there as part of this consumption? You know, like retreat to consumption and self-love and self.
This is precisely the point, is that when the explosion disappeared, a new kind of meaning of what decolonization became, you know, a new meaning of decolonization. It meant retreating into tribal, gender, I'm saying this is not to say these things are not important, but there was a relation between a unifying force that confronts white supremacy, and then which then disappears, and then what you get white people becoming part of these movements and leading from the front and being praised for this, and you know, and you get all sorts of kind of tribal and gender divisions and all kind of things going on.
Yeah, I don't want to get caught up in the kind of criticism of Rose Must Fall. I mean, this is...
No, I'm not even talking at the level of Rose Must Fall. I'm just saying at the level, this is what the politics, even at the university and even in a number of places.
In the corporations as well. I mean, for instance, there were law firms, I mean, that relaxed their hair codes so that brothers with hair like Andy can practice law. You know, and, you know, major top 5 South African corporations speaking about being decolonized as a recruitment drive for the alumni of these student movements. And of course, you know, some of the leading professional class now are clad in you know. So the point is precisely just like blacks can now tell you know, their white neighbors you know, and say, you know, I'm a partner at Weber Wenzel. Is still the recourse, you know. So the point is also still always, I'm not a kafir like that. It's still the ANC's point to the Queen that we are not, you are treating us like kafirs, but we are educated Christians. And so now you can be an educated Christian who doesn't comb your hair. And
okay, I'm going to interrupt you there, comrades. And I mean, I know of a very good lawyer who has who writes books like that. Blacks, the land is ours. But there are questions coming from the Facebook participants, and you know, I'm looking at my time. I think we have about less than 20 minutes left. So we're going to have to try to answer some of these questions. I've seen 3. I don't know if you've seen it. The first one was linking Black consciousness to Lenin.
I wanted to say that I'm going to the bathroom quickly. I'll be back.
All right. That's good. We have learned from Zimnawana that is fine. Even when you are playing, I mean, full on, you can go to the bathroom, you know, even if you play drums or piano, whatever, when nature calls you, go. All right. Let's see if we can answer some of these questions. There's, I think, about 7 questions that has come through. I don't know if you comrades can see those questions.
Yeah. I'm putting them in the chat. I can see them.
Also, must go to the chat. Okay, good. All right, I'm there. George, are you seeing them?
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Okay, Noble Sons ask, I wonder how do you link Lenin with Black consciousness thinking? Where do the two meet to become one as a philosophy? Do you want to go to that, or we should wait for Dooms?
I know anyone can answer. Ziana can answer.
Ziana, go.
I mean, it's such a big question. Where do we start? So personally, I know my sort of early readings of Lenin dealt with texts that Black consciousness people don't care for, okay? Which is issues of imperialism, issues of a national question, and so on. People of Black consciousness sometimes tend to focus on stuff for the state, which, you know, but also, so on the one hand, there's a question of imperialism that I think is central to how we think in the Black consciousness movement. Of course, let us say from the outset, I guess Lenin, maybe slightly better than Marx, is steeped in a white supremacist space and time. And so there's a lot that we are going to discard naturally. I do think that we need not throw the bathwater out with the baby. And so, and so there are some things that I think are significant. Tactics of struggle, definitely. If people, Lenin was able to, precisely on this question of co-option, able to co-opt a time and a movement that was useful. But also I think this question of dialectics is super important to me right now, just because I'm reading so much about it. And in this particular instance, you can see the sort of development of a kind of dialectical materialism that we get in large part from Lenin, which I think becomes interesting in understanding very concrete conditions. And by this, I mean, it becomes easier for us to understand that the fundamental contradiction in South African society, and I would argue globally, is one of race and one of racial discrimination, white supremacy, etc. I do think that there's a way that we can arrive at this point via thinking dialectically. But again, I think the first position is an issue of imperialism and a question of self-determination in particular that I think is central to Black consciousness.
There is a second question, but I think from Leslie Mulloy about Black consciousness just starting from tertiary environment and we are neglecting high schools. I think it's a practical question of organizing. I don't think we can argue against that. But I think Monde Nguni's question, he says fascinating, and I want Georgia and Comrade Dooms to check that question. He says fascinating. I do wish that you unequivocally answer the question, which blacks are blacks that cannot be racist? Steve Biko BC, definition or?
Georgia is the one who raised this question.
I know. I was raising it as a problem that has been coming up. This is a very fascinating thing because when people say Biko's definition of Black consciousness is problematic because it includes everybody. I think we are unfair to how Steve Biko actually raises this question. Biko consistently, and there's a section where he speaks about blacks and coloreds relationship, blacks and Indians relationship. But at every point, Biko doesn't stay away from the fact that the historical victim of colonization and racism in the imagination of the colonizer is a very specific being, which everybody else has to be distanced from, and all those kind of things. So I mean, it doesn't say that, because a lot of people want us to say it is the indigenous people, blah 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 blah, which is the truth. And then they implicate Biko in this thing without taking into full consideration that Biko's recourse to a different definition was simply a political strategic position. It doesn't take away from the fact that Black people have been, the indigenous population of this country has been the most badly treated people, and they remain at the bottom of the social hierarchy. So, but I mean, to say blacks can't be racist, I mean, for me, it simply means those indigenous folks who have, I don't know how to answer this question. It's difficult even for me. I can't say who can and cannot be racist under these circumstances. I mean, if you think about Sobuko's response on the Indian question, for example, like, how the Indians treated, but again, these are specific Indians, or how, yeah, so I mean, it's a very difficult question. I don't know how to.
Why is it difficult? I don't understand why is it difficult. In this sense that once you accept Igor's definition, which we do, of black, that black does not erase the contradictions amongst the black group itself. Because often people struggle with the fact that Indians treat us so badly. And therefore, if you include them in the black, you are, in a sense, then erasing this experience of black people with Indians. I mean, go to the Western Cape, people who look like Ziana, they call people who look like you Kefas and so on, right?
Yeah.
And if, you know, and I know in Cape Town, a very strange thing, Xhosa speaking people, they have a problem with Amasulumani, particularly Amasulumani, the slums.
Yeah.
But the slums, the Indian and the African from the white perspective, are actually the same thing in the South African situation. Even if there were some privileges given to differentiate for the purposes of control, in reality, those differentiations were determined by white power, right? Mm-hmm. And because it says organize on the basis of your exclusion and don't allow these, you know, if you like, differences to disorganize you. But we must be very clear. We would not accept this Indian Gandhian, you know, tribal attack on black people. Because often when we say about black consciousness, people think we accept these practices. Even Biko himself is aware of those intra-black problems. Just like gender, the patriarchal problem. Black men are a problem, not just to themselves, to black women as well, right? But we don't elevate them to what? The status of the enemy. We have to work through this.
I mean, does it answer the question whether they can or cannot be racist? I mean, it doesn't say much who are the blacks of blacks can be
all
racist.
The blacks can be racist.
Well, I mean, I think we have to return to the how the formulation is constituted. It suggests that power is required. It sets out economic and political power, and we add to that historical power. So about whoever it is that is being called racist, let's ask the question about whether they possess the power necessary to practice racism, and we should have our answer. The point is that everyone could be co-opted, but the possession of that power is a possibility condition you know, to practice racism. And the question is whether these people do or don't have the power. In the question of Indians, for instance, you know, the economics people have suggested that over the past 20 years, conditions have changed such and such a way. I don't know. I'm not purporting to answer the question, but I'm saying if we approach it in the way in which the definition itself was formulated, this is the question which ought to be asked. It's about the actual living and life conditions of the people so described, and whether they possess the power to perform racism. And if the answer is affirmative, then for the same, you know, then we'd say that they are racist. And if the question is that this is obfuscatory and they are actually victims of the very same thing, whether they are willing victims or not, then the answer would be that they are not racist. But I think it's an empirical question. We can...
No, you see, I think you're going against your own position here, because if you had maintained that power was limited to maybe like cultural, economic, whatever else, maybe the position would have been okay. Once you introduce the concept of historical power in the two senses that you do, in the first case being historically having had power, and in the second instance having power over history and the production of history itself, if that is the case, you then make only white people racist. Exactly. Or only white people is having the capacity to be racist. And you make this, you know, a problem of colonialism the world over. So now what has happened, because I mean, who else can really claim to have all these other kinds of power plus historical power, and so power in its broadest sense, you know, it sort of becomes an impossible thing. And it also becomes not an empirical thing anymore. It becomes an issue of who was declared human, who was not. I mean, not empirical in the sense of like...
Yeah. I mean, Arabs are an interesting question, for instance, given their slave trade and conquest of parts of the continent prior to the advent of white supremacy.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, through the passage of history, they themselves become conquered by our subsequent conquerors. And in the hierarchical structuring of human beings, then take a lower rung than the one they assumed during the time at which they conquered these African territories, you know. So, I mean, is racism white supremacy? And is white supremacy the same as anti-blackness? You know, because I think now we need to fragment descriptors about whether by racism we win white supremacy. And by definition, it would appear that only whites can be white supremacists. Other people can be instruments that whites use to advance white supremacy. They can even be willing, but their own benefits, their own political ontological benefits wouldn't hold, except as instruments of whites. But then blacks can also be anti-black, you know? So,
I mean, wouldn't you say Cyril Ramaphosa is anti-black?
Certainly.
No, yes. I mean, I understand anti-black to be applicable to black people. Black people can be anti-black, but they cannot be racist. They are instruments. I don't think anti-blackness and white supremacy are the same things. They're not equivalent.
Right.
No.
We as black people, amongst ourselves, we can reproduce anti-blackness, right? Which, of course, is in furtherance of the white supremacist project and their benefits. Cyril Ramaphosa, a good example. His benefits, the ANC has benefited the leadership, in the sense that you have access to BE tenders, I don't know, whatever. But as we see, because you're black, they still can come down for you, right? So you can have your BE deals, you can lose them tomorrow. And then you are like me. You are poor again, whether you have your hair.
Hey, Maltese.
Yes, okay. So I think though this is a real question. Most of our comrades from KwaZulu-Natal, the experiences they have with the Indian population is very difficult. So we have to be careful how we conceptualize this issue, because there are also charlatans who are distorting what black consciousness is to simply say, if you are still big of black consciousness, it means that you accept Indians, Indian oppression, and all that goes with that, which is complete nonsense. Let's take another question. There's a long question.
I just want to jump in before you go on. Apart from, I mean, I feel like this portion of Biko's definition of black often gets sort of marginalized in favor of figuring out like inter-black stuff, like are Indians in or out, are coloreds in or out. I think nobody in this category is in or out as an entire group, right? Which is to say that Biko does make the point about political commitment as a requirement for being black. So it seems like an unreserved, like, oh yes, we'll accept all the coloreds, or yes, we'll accept all the Indians, or yes, we'll accept all the men. Like,
but in principle, that's what it is. In principle, but then I mean,
I don't think you can pry apart these two definitions of black. I think at some point there needs to be a very serious decision. There are some black people who are going to not be committed to this project. Those black people need to get the fuck out.
Yeah, but Georgia, that's the point. Biko solved that problem by introducing the concept of non-white, isn't it?
Yeah. But I don't think this question is really solved in that manner. I think that there's a much more strange way. I mean, particularly if we're going to relate it to the question of whether they can be racist or not.
How can they be racist if they're black, though? You see, I mean, I have a difficult. I thought Biko resolved this, and we brought in Afro-pessimism to also help us a little bit there, where we argue
Afro-pessimism doesn't help us at all in this case. It will argue that
we go the other way around if it was.
Yeah.
If we kept to the strict Afro-pessimist letter.
Let me just from what I would argue is this: if you take whiteness as the black as the main category of difference between us, black and white, right? The vertical relationship from white to black does not accommodate these differences that we see when we think of that relationship horizontally amongst black people, right? So from white to black, all black are black. But amongst us, this definition of Biko, black people have to be black by taking a position, a political position. But however, from the point of view of oppression, they're all black. There's no differentiation from the point of view of the oppressor, or is there?
There's a material differentiation.
Yeah, there's a huge
consistently, because especially in places where black people are in a majority, the creation of a hierarchy is a necessary thing for the project to sustain itself, right? There must be colored people in better schools. There must be Indian people selling stuff. There must be, men must feel a sense of superiority, whatever. I mean, on that level, sure, it's white supremacy that's doing all of the, there's no kind of self-determination amongst any of the groups, horizontally or otherwise, but from the point of view of white supremacy, it's a material differentiation for sure.
But you see, but I think we must move on from this question, but it's a question we must return to, certainly, because it has implication for how we move to the next step of how we organize. I mean, I'm worried all the time about what our theoretical conclusion suggests about how we organize to confront, right? So this question must be addressed. I think it remains open. It remains open, but I do think that, as far as white people determine the difference, it becomes a difference which is not ours.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right?
Well, there are people who would say that the material conditions under which Biko develops this strategy is being based on the non-European campus of UKZN. That simply by the effect of the numbers of people and the populations they came from, to organize a large number of people against, that was the primary consideration, and the political subjects that he was working with under those conditions, that those material conditions dictated the ability to put those people together who were on that campus, and they were counterposed by the divisions on the campus from the white campus of UKZN, and then organized against NUSAS. As a result of that, but I agree that we should hold another Zoom specifically for this question.
No, I have a better suggestion. Maybe the next New Frank talk should be returning to this exact question.
Right.
Yeah, maybe a couple of people involved return to this question, because there's some kind of really serious confusion, but at the same time, the major blockage is on the question that Biko was saying this on, the possibility to organize, the possibility to resist. That is what has been now stopped by this process. So people do not want to have these solidarities because this question has not been cleared. I think, and if maybe we would attempt thinking around this question again, in terms of maybe a comeback of New Frank talk again, and dealing specifically with this question, it would make sense.
Yeah, and a comparative view. The PAC's internal debate, we understand, but the PAC structured the question on the question of title to territory. And so on African heritage and title to territory, you know, historic titles was the basis on which it was supposed to, that determination was made in the PAC's, and even the PAC's is a development away from Lembede's accepting of the four nations thesis as such. So we can track the development of this question for today. We can track it. If the old position is still defensible, then it can be defended. But I think it seems to be a popular question, you know.
Certainly.
So let's agree to return to it then
No, I think we must make that commitment to come back to this question. It consumes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Most of if we're organizing in KwaZulu-Natal, we are not going to make progress. And I know some comrades felt our definition of black, which is a Steve Biko definition, actually made them to move away from our movement. So there are real questions there that needs to be worked through. There is a question from people can pick questions, but Petru. His question or her question is, what is your take on the critique that most scholars who write about Biko tend to reproduce his ideas and not necessarily present something new into the discussion of Black consciousness? So there's the question. Most of us who deal with this issue add nothing to Black consciousness.
What is to add? We want the old ones.
Well, the question is whether biblical scholars add anything new to the Bible. I mean, if God sends his word down to humankind, what is there to add except to preach the gospel? No, but you know, very interestingly, read a really excellent essay written by a white analytic social philosopher named Brian Epstein on Biko. Truly brilliant. I mean, and suggesting that new insight is certainly possible through a close rereading and consideration of new historical conditions. I mean, new thinking is not something that simply revolves around the people who think the new thoughts. It also revolves around the historical conditions around which old questions are thought. Sometimes the question remains the same, but posed to a different audience and context, it produces different answers, you know. People tend, in the sort of bourgeois individualist mode, to assume that original thinking is simply a question of original thinkers, that the question of originality revolves around the sole genius. But the point is that Biko himself, even as an original articulator and synthesizer of a perspective, is really in part of a historical lineage in which he gives expression to which predate him, you know. By some account, by more than a century. They are ideas which germinate in the historical struggle of our people, and they find different articulation. People with the discourse of them 6 o'clock train find the language to express originally what is expressed by people in political theory journals in one particular way. So the question of originality is quite elusive, and should never be over. What are going? Bathroom break. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I mean, I have no doubt that a lot of us are just repeating what Biko has said, and there's some criticism to be said for that. But I think that the question of original formulations coming out revolves around a lot of different historical and structural conditions, and it is not necessarily a question of individual thinkers thinking things through. And in this case, I mean, I've heard people saying Biko was a plagiarist who had no original thoughts in his production, and every major idea in Biko's thought can virtually be traced back to a number of predecessors. And they are part partly correct, they are also partly incorrect. And it comes to the question of what originality means, because even during this conversation, we've all been using words that none of us originated, you know. So the question of when original thinking begins to happen is a really elusive philosophical question. So, I mean, I take the point, but I think we need a specific criticism to some work that this person is bothered by. They need to say, I've read Georgia's essay, it's unoriginal rubbish, that's just repeating Biko here and there. Then he will be in a position to explain what he was doing to Biko and why he felt this needed to be written in this and that way. And it may not have needed to be written. Some things we are just doing in order for people to know what is already there, you know.
You know what has been surprising is in a number of these text on Biko, one finds a very strange connection of Biko, at least in the cultural sectors, cultural field, art history, cultural, literary history, and all those kind of things, where people write about Black consciousness as some form of an extension of the Freedom Charter. And this is what is slightly becoming new knowledge. Uguti, this is uncovered knowledge that has been repressed by Black nationalists in the Orthodox BC orientation. For example, I found this one lady who's writing about tracing the iconography of Black consciousness in terms of the images that show up that are always related to Biko or the movement itself. And her point is to say, Black consciousness was not about race. In fact, Black consciousness had harnessed the non-racialist ethos while the ANC was banned. But non-racialist doesn't, not even in the sense in which you mean it, but in the proper ANC non-racialist sense. But Biko had to temporarily exclude Black people so that Black people can rehearse together, because she's saying Black consciousness is not about race, it's about voice. Right? And it's a popular thing. I mean, it's a really important book. It's called Bantu's Ghost or Biko's Ghost. You remember?
Shannon Hill.
Shannon Hill. So it's about this idea of this voice, this unraised voice. And that is the essence of Biko. And then you do find a similar thing in how, for example, Kolela reads Sobukwe and Mandela, as if there's a kind of continuous ideological discursive relation between the two. You see what I'm saying? So, yeah. and this is what is becoming new knowledge. The attack on the so-called race essentialism of groups like Blackwash, Azanian schools and so forth, is on the basis of most of the white Marxists, is that they essentialize Manichaeanism.
Right.
So this retreat into non-racialism and Biko is actually what would now be termed the new scholarship, the new development of Black consciousness.
We have 10 minutes left.
Yeah?
We have 10 minutes left, and I hope we can raise one question, and then you can make your concluding statements. Now, I mean, this question is this. We are in COVID-19 globally, COVID-19, coronavirus, and some of the data coming through is that Black people, initially we thought Black people would not be affected, and I was praying and I really was hoping that for the first time something horrible is happening, but we, Black people, God finally has heard our prayers and will not be affected, right? But when it did catch up, and you look at in the UK, a new study shows that Black people are likely to be killed by this thing 4 times more than white people. I see in Chicago, Black people constitute about 30% of the population, but if you look at the number of dead people or the percentages, 70% of Black people actually died. Right? And so in the South African situation, we don't know. They don't want to give us, by the way, they don't disaggregate those numbers of people die by race. Very strange, but they'll give you the percentage by gender. They'll tell you how many men and the age, but not race. We have asked, I don't know, I mean, also your maybe initial thoughts about why would they not tell us? If you want to tell us about how many men die and how many women and what ages are, why wouldn't you add race? Here's the point that I worry about is that if Black people are dying in these spaces as a result of socioeconomic reality of racism, then we in South Africa should be making the claim that this is going to happen to us. And shouldn't we be arguing for resources? I mean, over R1 trillion has been spent as we speak, but this money went to white business. Shouldn't this money be coming to Black people to address these socioeconomic conditions to be able to protect us from the real possibility of being attacked, not just by this wave, because there'll be more other waves that come. And if you're compromised by virtue of your socioeconomic standing, you're likely to die. So I'm arguing that is COVID-19 also not a question for us to argue for reparation from this point of view, that Blacks are victims, as this Black country racist rubric of thinking is assisting and insisting that in South Africa, all this money should correctly have been redirected to Black people. I mean, today, only we realize that our brothers in the EFF have also contributed 6 million rand that goes to a kitty, which basically is money that is being used by white capital. I mean, again, because of lack of this language of Blackness, there was no call. This money must go to Black people, right? But I'm just saying in this context of COVID-19, doesn't this kind of thinking, Blacks can be racist, assist in insisting on resource allocation has to be for redress of the historical injustice for Black people. That's my, yes.
I mean, it's such a nice proposal, but this is the point always. Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, the point about resource allocation going to the majority of the population should be an obvious thing, right? But I want to make the point that especially with this COVID situation right now, it's not only a point that socioeconomic factors or inequality function as a comorbidity to the disease, but more so that when the state is, or the healthcare system, public healthcare is unable to solve this problem, the decisions about who lives and who dies, who gets a ventilator, who doesn't, then become personal decisions, that the doctor gets to make or whatever. And of course, in that kind of situation, which probably accounts for the Chicago situation, for most of, most Black states in the US, most states in the US who have Black people in them, this problem is then just going to play out as like a racist sort of unconscious impulse to save the white life, right? So on top of the socioeconomic factors, there's also this problem, which, secondly, it's very interesting that, so if we take the distinction between killing and letting die to be a false distinction, okay? And we say that the pandemic is mostly happening in, say, the capitalist core. It's very interesting that those Black people can die without a problem, but most of Africa, so where all the exploited labor is, that entire labor market, all of those Africans are like, you get to live just enough for you to be able to work. So in some sense, that kind of imperialist connection between the core and the periphery, who is for the most part not as affected, is a thing that I think people haven't been thinking about sufficiently enough. But yeah, I mean, I think now more than ever, capitalism is sort of in this situation, and it's another instance of where a Black left will be, and I say this begrudgingly, but like unable to co-opt this moment, because it just doesn't seem as if there's any kind of preparation for a general strike, a mass strike when this is done. In fact, it seems like teachers are going back to school if some of the conditions are met or whatever, and unions themselves are saying it's prohibited for anyone to decide that they're not going to work. So it seems as if the situation, even the precariousness that the pandemic is causing, you know, there's a kind of incapacity to co-opt it, which is, you know, the perfect moment now.
2 minutes each, comrades.
It's funny. There are a lot of organizations that call themselves revolutionary in South Africa, but in classic political theoretical terms, a state of disaster, a state of emergency, and the suspension of the regular course of legal political power is probably the best time for an actual revolution, when the military is deployed on the streets and not defending the sovereignty of the country, when parliament is suspended. These are the times which would be most ripe. Of course, they've started arresting people even for the exercise of the freedom of opinion. A young fellow from UCT who suggested that it was a ripe time to rob a bottle store without suggesting anyone should rob the bottle store was arrested 2 weeks ago on Facebook. So, talking about revolutionary theory might be dangerous, despite the fact that there are lots of people who call their organizations revolutionary. But it's interesting that we are living in a pretty ripe, of course, you would imagine that revolution, this would be a time for revolution when hungry people are being prevented from making any bread, when soldiers are beating people on the streets, that these are the times where the state, at least formally, in its structure, is actually at its most vulnerable from attack, for usurpation. But I don't think that any revolutionary organization is thinking about those terms right now, So, and I think we do have precisely this problem, as the COVID problem is just bringing into heightened view what has we've already been suggesting that despite the miracle of the transition, which supposedly prevented people from dying, Blacks have been dying in the kinds of numbers which are only usually seen in places of war. So when you have a state of disaster, which mimics even to, structurally the conditions of war, it should follow that the intensification of immediate death would also then, this should be a vindication of your theory in any case. This is what we should have expected, that Blacks are going to die. But as with Rhodes Must Fall and our other missed opportunities, the question, and I hate those motherfuckers who ask questions like, so what are we going to do about it? We're exposed in very particular kinds of ways. But even discursively, the media has shown itself of having such an intimate relationship with the regressive forces as to not even be able to critically discuss, even from a liberal point of view, the state has been pushing serious totalitarian modes, and it's only the fringe, the white Andiles, who are pointing this out on the other side. But the center and the regular liberal institutions are so complicit in playing along with capital and our government, which are the same thing after the presidency was purchased. So the cooperation between the media, there's a lot of things which are exposed. And the fact that
One minute done, Dooms. Our 1 minute is that we're gonna.
No, I'm done.
Georgia, do you have anything to say, my brother?
I'll do covered for me.
I want to thank you. I want to thank you all for participating. And some people stayed on for it is an hour and a half, I think, that we have gone on. Some is 2 hours for many people who have been ready there since 9:30. We thank them. And also the essay is available for sale. You can get it immediately as an ebook. We'll put up the details on the page. And also as a hard copy, you can order it through, there's a WhatsApp number you can just send or you can send an email, and hopefully the country is opened and your hard copy can come to you. You have, as Black people, we have to sharpen our capacity to think through these questions. And this essay, Blacks Can't Be Racist, is one such contribution. Thank you, everybody, and let us stay safe. Please use the hand sanitizer, whatever, and don't go into crowds. We know that there's no alcohol, and we see a lot of people drink water, people. It's a good thing to do.